we were asked to think theologically within our own traditions about water justice, I started racking my brain for what sort of passage or what sort of text I could use from the Christian tradition. And as I was sitting there with my Jewish and Muslim colleagues, I was a little bit impressed by the embarrassment of riches that they had in their different traditions. The Hebrew Bible, the Talmud had all kinds of stuff in there. The Quran, the Hadith has all kinds of stuff in there. The New Testament, which is the unique Christian scriptures, does not have very much about water justice in there. Water can be used as a symbol for other things. It can be used in ritual cleansing, like in baptism, but it's not typically thought of in terms of justice and access in the text of the New Testament. And so as I started looking through, the one text that I could find that really speaks to these questions in the New Testament was the book of Revelation.
The fire, the brimstone, the pale horse.
A beast. It was around the number 6 times 3. It was around fire, but it was also around gold, emeralds, diamond.
When I first heard about it, I remember my very first Bible study when I was a little kid, and that was the first book I wanted to read. And my uncle was leading the Bible study, and he was just like, you know, that's, let's save that for later.
So when we studied Revelation, I was surprised by the pick, by the choice of that particular text. It's not something that, in the faith tradition that I grew up in, we rarely looked at Revelation, or if it did, it was seen as a sort of like, and then there's Revelation and it's there. And, you know, it just was not something we dug into or really thought about. Individually, personally, I feel like I always had difficulty with the symbolic nature of it.
When I first heard Revelation, I actually got like a jolt of comfort. That being said, I also thought to myself, that's the weird book in the Bible. Like, that's the one where they like use a lot of metaphors and pictures and numbers and all this other stuff, where essentially someone can spend their entire lifetime focusing on Revelation and still at the very end have question marks.
I actually found Revelation to be not scary, but really more of a lesson, a guidance in terms of how water can be used in terms of both judgment and as mercy. So I was fascinated that we got to use Revelation.
Well, it kind of freaked me out because some of the things that we discovered in there are things that we're experiencing now. And so it left me still curious, a little bit uncomfortable, but not to the point where I would turn away from the knowledge. More like, I wonder what this particular conversation around signs means to me. And what are the signs that this unique person, needs to be aware of at this time? So that's where I landed with it at the end. And I was a lot less, it's a little scary, but it's also like what's happening now. And I'm in it, I'm living it, we're in it. And there's a fear factor, but there's also like amazing beauty and hope and mercy.
There's a saying in the world of religious studies that a text without a context is a pretext. In other words, if all we have is the text in front of us, if that's actually the approach that we take, if we don't have history, if we don't have background, if we don't understand context, then all we bring to it is our own assumptions and impose those upon the text. And actually, Christians have done this with the book of Revelation throughout the centuries, trying to read their own times into the book of Revelation, reading their own experiences, reading the symbols in the world around them, the political or social context that they have into the text, as opposed to going back and seeing, well, what is this first century text saying about the first century? What do we actually draw from it? What lessons can we get from it? And how can it speak to these contemporary questions like justice and water access? Revelation is a text that is written to a persecuted and alienated community. And a lot of the trauma, the violence, the hope that is in the text is about speaking to that community, this community that feels dominated by the Roman Empire, this community that feels alienated from their fellow Jews, this community that is in many ways living through what feels to them like an apocalyptic landscape. Their temple is gone. They are unconnected now from the world around them. And so the book is trying to get people to see the reality behind the reality they're experiencing. It's trying to get them to have hope. It's trying to get them to anchor themselves in God, anchor themselves in Jesus, and keep pressing on. So it's really a book about people who are on the down and outs. And it's a book about lifting them up, giving them a sense of empowerment and hope in the future. Sometimes Christians forget, very unfortunately, that Jesus was Jewish, and all of Jesus's early followers are Jews. The disciples are all Jews. And so as the Christian movement, as we call it, which is really a movement within Judaism at the start, as that Christian movement, or the Jesus Messianist movement, right? These people, these Jews who think of Jesus as Messiah, as it gets going, it has a sort of parasitic relationship with Judaism as it existed in the Roman Empire. And Judaism in the Roman Empire was not a marginal phenomenon. There were about 4 million Jews spread throughout the Roman Empire, the diaspora of Jews around the Mediterranean. There were about 4 million, which made up about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire over time has had to figure out how to accommodate this reality of Jews being such a large portion of the population and yet being religiously different. Now, when the Romans take over and they have these Jewish subjects, the Jews are not going to worship Caesar because they're monotheists. And so what they work out over time is a system of what they call a religio licitas, a licit religion. The Jews are allowed to practice their religion. They're allowed to worship in their temple. They're allowed to have their own particular monotheistic practices and beliefs. And as long as they pray for Caesar, not to Caesar, and as long as they pay their taxes, then they can exist within this world of the Roman Empire. They've kind of carved out this special place. Now, this becomes a problem once you start to have Christians, because the Christians, who again at the beginning are almost all Jews, all of these Jewish Christians are all in agreement that Gentiles, these pagans, these outsiders, people from the other nations, people who are not Jewish, can follow Jesus as Messiah. But the core question of the New Testament community, the core question of the early Christian church is, what does it mean for those Gentiles to enter into this Jesus Messianist movement? For the author of Revelation, John, he thinks that whatever Christianity may be, it has to remain Jewish. It has to remain kind of fit within his understanding of Jewishness. And so he cares very deeply about things like ritual purity. He cares very deeply about the liturgy of the temple. He cares very deeply about the symbols of Judaism. And so as he's writing and participating in this genre of apocalyptic literature, he's drawing very heavily on these themes from the Hebrew Bible, these images from the Hebrew Bible to anchor his sense of himself and his sense of his own community. He is trying to hold that community together even as they experience a sense of alienation from the synagogue and as they experience a sense of alienation from the Roman Empire. So the Romans episodically would begin persecuting the Christians, in part because they didn't have categories for them. So they've got an idea of pagan people, right? These polytheists who worship all kinds of gods and pray to Caesar. They've got an idea of Jews, this religio licitas, that they can understand, okay, well, they're monotheists and they pray to their one God, but they pay their taxes and they pray for Caesar. What do you do with these people who don't quite fit into either of those buckets? So when the Romans would persecute the Christians, often the claims that they would make about them is, A, they're impious, they don't have a good religion. Sometimes they would say they're atheists, as in they don't worship the gods. And sometimes they would say they're disloyal, because loyalty in the Roman Empire meant that you worship Caesar. And these Christians, they don't fit in the special carve-out but they also don't worship Caesar. So there's this deep suspicion. They seem like they're some sort of a religious fifth column within the Roman Empire. And this is where the Roman suspicion of them came. And so John's community is kind of living in this nebulous zone. They're not quite under the umbrella of the Religio Licitas. They're sort of on the outskirts of that. And so they're experiencing a certain form of persecution that he is trying to shore up their identity, to give them a sense of who they are and where they belong. The book of Revelation, just like all apocalyptic literature, has a rich vocabulary of symbols. A lot of those symbols operate around numbers. The book of Revelation is built around a series of sevens, which is a very important number in Judaism, right? 7 days of creation. It's also encoded in different language. And part of the reason people have misread, or at least read this book in such strange ways, is we don't have the key to decode the book. And so people have tended to bring into those symbols, oh, here, 144,000 people. We must know what that means, right? As opposed to trying to go back into the realm of apocalyptic literature to understand, well, how do other texts encode these things? So yes, John is trying to write to his community in such a way that they can decipher this text. But if a Roman picks it up and tries to use it as evidence of Christian disloyalty or Christian impiety, it just seems like a weird cosmic symbology. In Revelation, just as in a lot of the New Testament, there's a divide between heaven and earth, but it's not the divide that we think of today. Today, we think of these things in the terms that the philosopher Plato has said, where heaven is an ideal realm, a disembodied realm, a realm with angels playing harps on clouds, and earth is this concrete physical space that is constricting in some way, that the physicality is a problem of it. That's not the way that the Jewish community in the first century think about these things. For the early Christians and the Jews of the time, heaven is the realm where God reigns. It's the realm where God is sovereign, where God is in control. It's the realm where the angels do the will of God. And earth is the realm of chaos and persecution and problems and human empires that are corrupt. But heaven and earth overlap. So heaven is the super reality. It's the mega reality. It's the reality beyond reality. It's the supernatural aspect to earth. And earth is this physical realm, yes, but that's not primarily what it is. It's primarily the realm where God's will is not always done. And so when Jesus prays in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? And heaven is already the space where God's will is done. And the hope of the early church, the hope of Jesus, is that earth would also become a realm where God's will is done, a realm where the reign of God, the kingdom of God, would become embodied in the same way that it is in heaven. And so in Revelation, as it thinks about heaven and earth, and the story of Revelation begins on the earth, begins with John in exile on this island called Patmos, and he's writing letters to these different churches in Asia Minor, these different churches that are experiencing persecution, telling them, be strong, stand up, you can do this. And then suddenly in chapter 4, he's taken up. He kind of walks through a door and suddenly he's in heaven. And he's seeing things from this heavenly perspective. He's seeing the reality behind the reality that people are experiencing. And the vast majority of the book, chapters 4 through 20, is this scene, these different scenes of John in heaven, in the mega reality, watching things play out on the earth. Understanding, and this is a trope in apocalyptic literature, you have this heavenly perspective that gives you an understanding of what is going on around you. You suddenly get to know the cosmic perspective on your lived experience. The main point about heaven in Revelation, the main imagery that surrounds heaven is actually a dual image. One is that heaven is a throne room, where there's a throne, right? It's the king's space. This is the space of dominion of God. And it's also a temple. Now, again, the temple has been destroyed on earth. The Jerusalem temple is destroyed in 70 CE. Revelation is probably written around 90 CE, thereabouts. And so the entire world of symbols that existed for Jews in the first century, up until the destruction of the temple, is very focused around the temple, right? The temple in Jerusalem is the space where Jews would gather to worship. It's the space where priests would enact the rituals and the ceremonies. It's the space where God was somehow present. And when the Romans destroy the temple, suddenly all those symbols become unmoored. And so in several New Testament texts, actually, there's this envisioning of a heavenly temple. The book of Hebrews also has this enactment of the temple in heaven. And in Revelation, the temple is now in heaven, and most of the book of Revelation plays out as a cosmic liturgy, a cosmic religious service, where now angels and these heavenly beasts are performing the religious service in the temple. And as this heavenly liturgy is going on, it is pouring out judgment and destruction on the earth. That somehow through this liturgy, through this religious service that is going on in the temple in heaven, the earth is being cleansed of its corruption. So it's a temple, it's also a throne room. And this is where in chapter 4, when John kind of walks through the door and is suddenly in this heavenly throne room, he sees on the throne a lamb. And so the image of the slaughtered lamb that becomes absolutely core for the book of Revelation. Anytime it's talking about the lamb, it's usually capital L, the lamb, and it's a symbol of Jesus, the slain king. We get introduced to the two villains of the book of Revelation. One of them is a city, and one of them is the beast. And the city is Babylon, which, again, is a code for Rome, right? The first Babylon destroyed the first temple. The second Babylon, Rome, has destroyed the second temple. And this Rome, in the book of Revelation, is described as a woman. She is the embodiment of impurity. And this is the way that the author wants to talk about Rome. Rome, this empire. Rome and the woman in Revelation, this is a symbol for this corrupt empire that is holding people down, that is persecuting the Jewish Christians. Now the beast in Revelation is a symbol for Caesar. And so the beast is the one villain who dominates people as Caesar, and then Rome as the city. And even in the text, there's the image of the woman sitting on top of the beast. She's riding on top of the beast, right? Caesar is using the power of Rome, the power of this imperial city, to dominate the rest of the world. And in the book of Revelation, the beast is an absolutely polarizing figure. Everyone has to take this mark on their foreheads or on their hands that encodes that they belong to the beast. And similarly, in the book of Revelation, anyone who follows the Lamb has his name on their foreheads. And so you either follow the beast, you either worship the beast, or you worship the Lamb. And so these Christians who are resisting worshiping Caesar, resisting the imperial cult, resisting the cultural powers around them, are the ones who are experiencing persecution. And the woman and the beast are these symbols of earthly human powers that are trying to set themselves up in opposition to God and in opposition to the Lamb. And one of the images that keeps coming up whenever the beast is described is he's just spewing blasphemy. He's just spewing this hatred of God. And so it's this kind of dichotomy, right, between the earthly empire, the imperial world that hates God, that hates the people of God, versus the people who are loyal to the Lamb, the people who are living in this ultimate cosmic reality. Message of Revelation as a whole can more or less be boiled down to hold on. Hold on. The world looks crazy. It feels like a very dire situation, and the Revelation is saying, hold on. Don't go and worship the beast. Don't cave. to empire. Don't cave to these human forces, because the divine reality is God is in control and God is going to save us. Even if it means we die, even if it means that we pass through persecution, hold on, because the denouement, the end of all of this is coming, and we can see that light at the end of the tunnel. There's a scene in Revelation chapter 18 where, and this really kind of captures, I think, what the problem, what the issue is that the author of Revelation and his community have with Rome. And it's a scene of as Rome is starting to be destroyed in the series of events. The merchants of Rome gather, and they're weeping because they can't sell their treasure. They can't sell their luxury items. And it actually gives an extended list of these luxury items that they have been selling. There are 20 things on this list: chariots, wine, gold, frankincense, myrrh, all these things that make you think of luxury and wealth. And it gets to the end of the list, and the last two things on the list are slaves and human lives. That's the critique of Rome that Revelation is participating in. The edifice of the Roman Empire, these luxuriating, wealthy people, the Caesars who dominate the world around them, this pyramid of power and authority and domination that is the Roman Empire, is built upon a foundation of slaves and human exploitation and human trafficking. From the author of Revelation's perspective, human empire is fundamentally unjust. It's fundamentally rooted in inequality, rooted in exploitation, rooted in domination, rooted in corruption. And so we, as the people who are living in this community, look out at that, and it is the ungodliness of empire that is being judged in Revelation. A very important scene for understanding the passage that we're going to look at together in Revelation 21 and 22 actually happens in chapters 15 and 16. This is the end of the sequence of the heavenly liturgy. You've had the 7 seals on the scroll. You've had the 7 trumpets that are blowing with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And now you have the 7 bowls of God's wrath. And again, it's an image of angels taking this liquid form of God's wrath and pouring it out on the earth. And as each one is poured out, a different plague afflicts the people of the earth. And it very much parallels the plagues of Egypt in Exodus. As you have one of the bowls is poured out and all the waters on the earth are turned to blood. Again, taking back from the imagery of the Exodus. Or it's poured out and sores appear on the followers of the beast. And so you have the scene of the liquid of God's wrath, the judgment of God in liquid form being poured out onto Babylon, onto this wicked city. And at every stage as this is going on, the people refuse to repent. They refuse to turn around. They refuse to recognize what is happening, what this pain that is inflicting them. When we think about water, it gives us life. It sustains us. Where most of our bodies are water, you can't go even a few days without drinking water. And yet water also is an incredibly destructive force. Think of the power of a hurricane, the power of a flood. A flash flood that suddenly water has taken over, and we are threatened by water. And I think the power of the imagery of this scene in Revelation 15 and 16 is water has become this destructive force that is ruining and destroying this wicked empire, this corrupt and unjust empire. And the last bowl, the 7th bowl, as it's poured out, there's an earthquake. And Babylon or Rome splits apart. All these cities of the world are destroyed. Right? This is the end of this heavenly liturgy, is that the world has been washed clean. It's been cleansed through this liturgy, through this pain, this destruction, this judgment. Christians are often leery about talking about the judgment of God, but it's very much a part of the imagery of the New Testament. But this judgment has cleansed the earth of its corruption, of its injustice, of its environmental degradation. Some of the imagery of Revelation very much thinks about environmental degradation, destruction of the earth as such. But it's all been wiped away. What this leaves us with this question of what comes after it. After all this destruction, after all this wiping away, there's a scene in heaven of people preparing for a wedding. And it says the lamb, right? This Jesus, this persecuted, slaughtered lamb is getting married. And there's this kind of question that's left open of, well, who's the bride? And what we find out in Revelation 21 and 22 is the bride is a new city that is not Babylon, that is not Rome. It's the contrast to this Babylon, Rome, corrupt empire. That's the passage that we're going to be looking at together. At the center of this new city is a river of the waters of life. It's flowing from the throne of the Lamb, from the throne of God, and planted all along the sides of this river are the trees of life. The imagery of Revelation 21 and 22 has taken the imagery of Eden, the Garden of Eden, right, which was a garden built around rivers with the tree of life at the center of it, and it's urbanized that. Right? So now you have a linking of Eden into this urban space. Water has become something that gives life again.
One of the things that we were left with, I mean, these conversations and the classes were so rich that I had never wanted them to end. But we were left with the notion of the understanding of the New Jerusalem. There was a very vivid description of how there would be a boulevard, and water was running down the boulevard, and the trees and all the vegetation were growing, and was rich, and everyone got to enjoy it. And I was wondering, in terms of justice and where that imagery comes to play. I think that's a beautiful imagery that can be utilized in terms of establishing justice and access that I rarely hear or have heard before in interfaith dialogue regarding justice. So I just thought that was a beautiful opportunity for personal growth and for imagery for our society to share it.